The heavy-duty windshield wipers of my Ford F250 fought a losing battle against the sheer volume of white descending from the black sky. It wasn't just snow. It was an abrasive, horizontal sheet of ice crystals driven by a 30-mile-per-hour crosswind that threatened to push the 3-ton truck off the narrow mountain pass. I kept both hands firmly clamped on the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2, feeling the subtle, dangerous slip of the tires beneath me. I eased off the accelerator, letting the engine braking of the lower gear keep us steady, refusing to touch the brake pedal. In these conditions, locking the brakes meant a one-way trip down a 400-foot ravine. The forecast said 3 to 5 inches, not a complete atmospheric dump, I said, keeping my eyes locked on the faint, reflective markers of the guardrail. In the passenger seat, Madeline Gardner remained perfectly still. She wasn't clutching the dashboard. She wasn't pressing an imaginary brake pedal. She sat with the quiet, rigid composure of a woman who had spent the last 2 decades suppressing panic in boardrooms. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over a cashmere turtleneck, entirely inappropriate for a blizzard, but perfectly suited for the corporate retreat she was supposed to be hosting at her family's ridgetop cabin. The meteorologists were apparently operating on outdated modeling, Madeline replied. Her voice was smooth, a low, modulated tone that betrayed no fear, only a deep, vibrating irritation. She held her phone in her lap, the screen glowing against the dark interior of the cab. Ava said she was 30 minutes behind us. The mention of her daughter, my girlfriend of exactly 5 months, caused a dull, familiar ache of exhaustion to settle behind my eyes. I didn't say anything immediately. I focused on a sudden drift across the center line, steering into the slide slightly before the 4-wheel drive bit into the packed powder, righting the chassis. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, lit up with a single incoming text message. I didn't need to look at it, but the notification bell chimed loudly in the quiet cab. Madeline glanced at the screen. The preview text was clearly visible. Ava. Roads look bad, babe. Turning around. Going to stay in Denver with Chloe. Sorry. You and Mom hold down the fort. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. I didn't curse. I didn't sigh dramatically. I just reached over and pressed the power button on the side of the phone, turning the screen black. Ava's flakiness wasn't a sudden crisis, it was an established pattern. She lived in a world of soft options and easy exits. Her mother, sitting beside me, lived in the exact opposite. She turned around, Madeline stated. It wasn't a question. She turned around, I confirmed, my voice flat. Which means we are the only ones on this elevation. The county won't push plows up this far until the storm breaks. We have about 4 miles to the cabin. Madeline looked back down at her own phone. The glow illuminated the sharp, elegant lines of her jawline and the faint, stress-induced tightness around her eyes. I have no signal. It dropped 3 miles ago. The towers on the ridge rely on microwave links. Heavy precipitation scatters the signal, I explained, shifting my grip on the wheel as a massive gust of wind rocked the truck. We're cut off until the sky clears. Suddenly, Madeline let out a sharp, compressed breath. It wasn't fear of the storm. It was the realization of a trap closing. Arthur, she whispered, the name carrying a weight of pure venom. The chief operating officer? I asked, keeping my focus on the road. I knew the players in her world only tangentially, mostly through the complaints Ava occasionally relayed when she bothered to pay attention to her family's real estate empire. Before the signal dropped, an automated corporate email came through, Madeline said, her fingers tightening around her phone. A formal notice of an emergency board meeting, Monday morning, 8 a.m. He invoked Section 4 of the bylaws. He's calling a vote of no confidence to push through the sale of the downtown parcels. I processed the logistics. And if you aren't there to cast your proxy in person? He wins the vote, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, quiet register. He waited until I was physically isolated at the retreat. He knew the storm was coming. He knew Ava wouldn't be here to take the proxy on my behalf. He timed it to strip me of the company my father built, using a weather pattern as his executioner. She stared out the window into the blinding white. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. It was the crushing weight of a woman who was always expected to have the solution, suddenly finding herself physically trapped by variables she couldn't outthink or outwork. "We need to get to the cabin," I said, my voice dropping into the firm, tactical cadence I used on active construction sites. We establish a secure thermal perimeter. We wait out the primary accumulation. Tomorrow, I will get you down this mountain, Madeline. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine in the dim light of the dashboard. "You can't engineer away a blizzard, Jackson." "No," I agreed, downshifting as the incline steepened. "But I can calculate the traction coefficient of these tires against an 8% grade. We'll make it." 10 minutes later, the truck died. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was physics. The wind had funneled a massive, unpredictable drift across a blind curve. I saw it too late. The wall of hard-packed snow was 4 feet high and stretched entirely across the 2-lane road. I hit the brakes, pumping them to maintain steering control, but the sheer mass of the truck carried us forward. The front bumper plowed into the drift with a heavy, concussive thud, throwing snow over the windshield and plunging us into darkness. The engine whined as the tires spun uselessly, completely suspended off the asphalt by the compacted ice beneath the undercarriage. We were high-centered. I turned off the ignition immediately to conserve the battery. The sudden death of the heater blower made the silence inside the cab feel absolute. The temperature was already dropping. "Status?" Madeline asked, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "We're high-centered," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt and reaching for the heavy mag light I kept in the center console. "The axles are resting on compacted snow. The tires have 0 contact patch with the road surface. We aren't driving out of this." I turned on the flashlight, illuminating the cab. Madeline's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "How far is the cabin?" she asked. "According to the odometer, 1.2 miles, I said. "Uphill." I didn't wait for her to process the danger. I turned to the back seat, pulling my heavy canvas gear bag forward. I unzipped it, revealing my winter survival kit. I pulled out a thick, insulated Carhartt jacket, a pair of heavy leather work gloves lined with fleece, and a woolen beanie. "Put these on," I said, handing the pile across the console to her. She looked at the oversized utilitarian clothing, then at her tailored wool coat. She didn't argue. She stripped off her designer coat, the rustle of the fabric loud in the quiet cab, and pulled my heavy work jacket on. It swallowed her frame, but the heavy canvas and insulation were exactly what was required. She pulled the beanie over her blonde hair, tucking the loose strands away. I watched her adjust the cuffs, noting that she didn't complain about the cold or the absurdity of the situation. She simply adapted. It commanded a deep, silent respect from me. "We leave the truck," I said, pulling my own secondary jacket on and grabbing a heavy iron pry bar from the floorboard. "The cab will drop below freezing in 40 minutes. Walking generates body heat. We follow the tree line to block the crosswind. Step exactly where I step." "Understood," she said. I pushed my door open. The wind nearly tore it from its hinges. The cold hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The snow was up to my thighs. I waded around to the passenger side, pulling the door open for her. Madeline stepped out, immediately sinking into the snow. The wind caught her, knocking her off balance. I didn't grab her waist or pull her against me. I reached out, my thick leather glove closing firmly around her forearm, acting as a rigid physical anchor. "Lock your knees when you find the bottom," I yelled over the roar of the wind, my voice authoritative but completely devoid of panic. "I'm going to break the trail. Do not stop moving." She nodded, her eyes wide but focused. The trek was brutal. Every step required lifting my leg entirely out of the snow, driving it forward and compressing the powder beneath my boot to create a solid platform for her to follow. The wind relentlessly battered the right side of my body. I angled my shoulders to take the brunt of it, acting as a physical shield for the woman walking in my wake. I didn't think about Ava. I didn't think about the absurdity of dragging my girlfriend's mother through a blizzard. I thought only of the mechanics of survival. Left foot, compress. Right foot, compress. Check her pace. Every 100 yards I stopped, turning back to face her. "Breathe," I commanded, watching the white plumes of her breath. "Check your fingers and toes. Are they numb or aching?" "Aching?" she gasped, her face pale, the oversized jacket covered in snow. "Good. Aching means blood flow. Numb means tissue damage. Keep moving." It took us an hour and 20 minutes to cover the mile. By the time the dark, massive silhouette of the A-frame timber cabin loomed out of the whiteout, my quadriceps were burning with lactic acid, and my lungs felt raw. We staggered onto the covered front porch. The wind was blocked here, offering a sudden, shocking reprieve. I let go of her arm. She leaned heavily against the log wall, her head tipped back, breathing in ragged, painful gasps. "We're here," I said, my voice hoarse. I pulled the heavy brass keys from my pocket. My fingers were stiff, lacking fine motor control. I forced the key into the deadbolt, feeling the cold metal bite through my gloves, and turned. It clicked. I threw my shoulder against the heavy oak door, forcing it open against the pressure differential. We stumbled inside. It was completely dark, and only marginally warmer than the porch. "Stay by the door," I instructed, pulling the flashlight from my pocket. "Do not move until I assess the perimeter." I swept the beam across the massive living room. The cathedral ceilings disappeared into the darkness above. The stone fireplace sat cold and empty. I moved quickly, checking the heavy double-pane windows for fractures, verifying the seals on the back doors. The structural envelope was intact. I walked back to her. She was shivering now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her body vulnerable to the core temperature drop. "Take off the wet outer layers," I said, pointing to the mudroom hooks. "I'm going to start the fire. The cabin relies on electric baseboards, which are dead. The hearth is our only BTU source." I moved to the stone fireplace. The previous caretakers had left a stack of seasoned oak logs and dry kindling in the brass cradle. I knelt on the cold stone, stripping off my wet gloves. I arranged the kindling in a precise, cross-hatched pattern to maximize airflow, ensuring the combustion would catch quickly. I struck a long match, holding it under the dry bark until a small, bright yellow flame licked upward. I stayed on my knees, feeding the fire methodically until the heavier logs caught, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. The heat began to radiate outward, pushing back the deep chill of the cabin. When I stood up and turned around, Madeline was standing near the edge of the rug. She had removed the wet Carhartt jacket and my beanie. Her blonde hair was falling loose around her shoulders, damp with melted snow. She looked incredibly small in the vast, dark room, stripped of her corporate armor. I pulled a heavy woolen blanket from the leather sofa and held it out to her. "Sit by the hearth," I said softly, the harsh, commanding tone of the trek replaced by a quiet, protective cadence. "Keep your bare hands away from the direct flame. Let the ambient heat warm you slowly." She took the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders, and sank onto the thick rug in front of the fire. She stared into the flames, her body trembling violently for several minutes before the warmth finally began to penetrate her core. I didn't hover. I walked to the kitchen, using the flashlight to locate the emergency supplies I knew Ava's family kept stocked. I found a camp stove, a canister of propane, and a box of Earl Grey tea. I boiled water methodically, the hissing of the stove a loud counterpoint to the howling wind outside. When I returned to the living room, carrying 2 heavy ceramic mugs, Madeline had stopped shivering. She looked up at me, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "You saved my life tonight, Jackson," she said. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a factual statement. "I applied basic risk mitigation," I said, sitting in the heavy leather armchair opposite her, setting her mug on the low wooden table between us. "Drink. 2 minutes of steeping, no sugar." She picked up the mug, wrapping both hands around it. She took a slow sip, closing her eyes as the hot liquid hit her stomach. "You remember my order?" "I have a good memory for details," I said simply. We sat in silence for a long time. The wind battered the heavy timber walls, a constant reminder of the chaos we had escaped. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of the oak logs and the soft clink of ceramic against wood. "Ava doesn't understand what she has," Madeline said quietly, staring into her mug. "She told me you were too serious, too rigid. She said you couldn't just let things happen." I looked at the fire. When things just happen in my line of work, buildings collapse, bridges fail, people get hurt. I don't have the luxury of letting gravity or weather dictate the outcome. "She thinks everything is a safety net," Madeline continued, her voice tightening with a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. "She doesn't realize that the net is made of people. People like me, people like you, holding the ropes until our hands bleed while she jumps." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said about my relationship. I had spent 5 months trying to anchor a girl who wanted to float away, ignoring the deep existential weariness it caused me. "You're tired of holding the rope, Madeline," I observed softly. She looked up at me, her defenses completely stripped away. "I'm exhausted, Jackson. If Arthur takes the company on Monday, a part of me almost wants him to. I'm so tired of fighting alone." The vulnerability in her voice was a physical weight in the room. She was 38 years old, a powerhouse of an executive, and in that moment, she just wanted someone else to carry the load. I felt a sudden, sharp pull in my chest. It wasn't physical desire, it was a profound, magnetic recognition. I saw her. I saw the competence, the burden, and the quiet dignity she carried. I wanted to step across the rug, pull her into my arms, and tell her that she could stop fighting. I wanted to be the wall between her and the world. But I stayed exactly where I was. I kept my hands resting on the arms of my chair. "Arthur won't take the company," I said, my voice steady, injecting absolute certainty into the room. "You are going to rest tonight. Tomorrow, I am going to clear the road. You will be at that board table on Monday morning." She stared at me, searching my face for any sign of doubt. Finding none, her shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch. She didn't say thank you. She just took a deep breath, and for the first time all night, the tension left her body. The rest of the night passed in a quiet, functional routine. We didn't discuss Ava again. The cabin grew colder as the night deepened, forcing us to remain close to the hearth. I dragged a heavy mattress from one of the guest rooms, placing it on the floor near the fire for her. I took the leather sofa, positioning myself between her and the main hallway, a silent, protective barrier. I woke up at dawn. The cabin was freezing, the fire reduced to glowing red embers. I moved silently, rebuilding the fire with fresh logs until it roared back to life. Madeline was still asleep on the mattress, her face half buried in the heavy blankets. She looked younger, the harsh lines of corporate stress smoothed out by exhaustion. I watched her for exactly 3 seconds, feeling that same deep, quiet pull, before I turned away and focused on the task at hand. I grabbed my coat and boots and headed outside. The storm had broken. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the world was buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. The cold was still bitter, but the wind had died. I walked the mile back to the truck. It took me 45 minutes. When I arrived, I assessed the situation. The truck was hopelessly high-centered, but the heavy-duty winch mounted on the front bumper was functional. I spent the next 3 hours engaged in grueling technical labor. I dug through the snowpack beneath the axles with a folding camp shovel, clearing enough space to drop the chassis back onto the asphalt. I spooled out 90 feet of steel-braided winch cable, securing it around the base of a massive, old-growth pine tree up the road, using a tree-saver strap to prevent damage to the trunk. I locked the winch remote, manipulating the tension, letting the powerful electric motor drag the 6,000-pound truck out of the drift, inch by agonizing inch, until the tires finally gripped solid ground. By the time I drove the truck back up to the cabin, my muscles were trembling with fatigue, my clothes soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. I walked through the front door. The cabin was warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the instant coffee she had found in the pantry. Madeline was standing by the window, fully dressed in her tailored clothes from the day before, though they looked slightly rumpled. She turned when I walked in, her eyes widening slightly as she took in my exhausted, snow-covered appearance. "The truck is clear," I said, my voice rough. "The county plows have likely cleared the state highway by now. We leave in 10 minutes. She didn't ask how I did it. She saw the physical toll it took, the undeniable proof of my competence and my promise. She walked over to me, stopping just inches away. I went completely still. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, something sharp and elegant. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing the snow from the shoulder of my jacket. It was a functional touch, but the proximity sent a heavy, grounding shockwave through my chest. "Don't tell my daughter about tonight," she said quietly, repeating her words from the night before, but the meaning had shifted entirely. It wasn't about hiding weakness anymore. It was about protecting a connection that belonged solely to us, untouched by Ava's careless world. "I won't," I vowed, my voice dropping to a low register. The drive down the mountain was methodical. The tension inside the cab wasn't the panic of the storm, it was the heavy, simmering reality of what happened next. I dropped her off directly in front of her corporate headquarters in downtown Denver. It was 7:30 a.m. on Monday. She didn't look back as she walked through the revolving glass doors, her posture rigid, her armor firmly back in place. I watched her until she disappeared into the lobby, then put the truck in gear and drove away. I ended things with Ava that afternoon. I didn't mention her mother. I simply stated that our foundational values were incompatible and cut the tie. Ava cried for 10 minutes, then posted a picture from a ski lodge with her friends an hour later. I felt nothing but a profound, quiet relief. 6 weeks passed. The winter thawed into a wet, gray spring. I threw myself into a complex structural retrofit project for the city, working 12-hour days, letting the math and the steel occupy the space in my head where the memory of the cabin lingered. I didn't reach out to Madeline. I respected the boundary. She was a CEO. I was the guy who dug her out of a snowbank. The lines were clear. Until a Tuesday evening in late April, I was standing in the middle of a noisy, crowded municipal planning office reviewing a set of blueprints with the city inspector. The room was chaotic, filled with contractors arguing over permits and architects defending their designs. The heavy glass doors at the front of the office swung open. The ambient noise in the room didn't stop immediately, but it began to taper off as Madeline Gardner walked in. She was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, carrying a leather portfolio. She looked exactly as she had the morning she walked into the board meeting, untouchable, powerful, and absolutely in control. She scanned the room, her eyes locking onto mine instantly. She didn't hesitate. She walked a straight line through the crowd of contractors, parting them like water, until she stopped directly in front of my drafting table. The city inspector next to me went silent, recognizing one of the most powerful developers in the state. "Jackson," Madeline said, her voice clear and carrying enough volume to be heard by the men standing nearby. "Madeline," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level, though a sudden, heavy certainty dropped into my chest like an anchor. "The board voted unanimously in my favor," she stated, looking me directly in the eyes. "Arthur has been removed from his position." "I read about it in the business journal," I said. "Congratulations." She didn't smile. She reached into her pocket and produced a heavy, newly cut brass key. She set it directly on top of my blueprints, the metal clinking softly against the table. "The HVAC system in my personal townhouse is rattling," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of a decibel, meant only for me, though the action was entirely public. "And I refuse to trust the structural integrity of my life to anyone else's engineering." It was a public choice, a definitive, irreversible action. She wasn't hiding me, and she wasn't hiding herself. By handing me the key in a room full of my peers, she was establishing an undeniable perimeter around us. She was claiming the partnership. I looked at the key, then up at her. The weariness that had lived behind her eyes for the last 6 weeks was gone. In its place was a quiet, absolute certainty. I didn't smile like a fool. I reached out and picked up the key, my fingers brushing against the blueprint. The cold metal felt heavy and real in my hand. "I'll bring my tools," I said quietly, a promise sealed in reality. You know that feeling when the floor drops out from under you, when the chaos of the world demands you to be something you're not? I learned that true victory isn't about fighting every storm. Sometimes it's about building a quiet sanctuary with someone who makes you feel safe enough to put down your armor. Love isn't about holding on tight to a forced image. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up when the power goes out. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.